Welcome everybody to the H-France webinar on democratic problems in the age of revolution. So I'm really happy to be moderating this panel today. The way I was thinking we could do this is I'm going to introduce our speakers very briefly because they all have very impressive CVs, but I'm just going to give you some of the basics and then let them speak for a few minutes and introduce the readings that they gave us from their new books, and then suggest a couple of general themes that I see running through all three works, and then basically open it up to discussion. So you guys should feel free, whoever's online community, feel free to type questions if you want me to read them, or call on David and he will call on you to like raise your hand, and you can appear on screen too. So I will just introduce everyone in alphabetical order. Dan Edelstein, who is William H. Bonsall Professor of French at Stanford, where he teaches courses on literature, philosophy, history, culture, and politics of the Enlightenment, 19th century novels, the French Revolution, early modern political thought, and French intellectual culture, including the brilliantly titled course that I want to steal, Coffee and Cigarettes. Yeah. He is the author of The Terror of Natural Right, Republicanism, the Cult of Nature, and the French Revolution, published in 2009 from Chicago, and The Enlightenment, a Genealogy, also from Chicago in 2010, and several co-edited collections, including Scripting Revolution with Keith Baker and Let There Be Enlightenment with Anton Maritson. Then Sophia Rosenfeld, who is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches European intellectual and cultural history with a special emphasis on the Enlightenment, the transatlantic age of revolutions, the legacy of the 18th century for modern democracy. So she is the author of A Revolution in Language, The Problem of Signs in Late 18th Century France, published by Stanford, Common Sense, A Political History, published by Harvard in 2011, and most recently of the book that we're discussing today, Democracy and Truth. Yes, I also should have said that Dan is also the author of the book that we're discussing today, on the spirit of rights. And finally, we have Stephen Sawyer, who is professor of history at the American University of Paris, where he specializes in urban and political history. He is the author of Demos Assembled, Democracy and the International Origins of the Modern State, 1840 to 1880, published by Chicago just last year, 2018, and of several co-authored projects, including Boundaries of the State in U.S. History with William Novak and James Sparrow, In Search of the Liberal Moment, Democracy, Anti-Totalitarianism, and Intellectual Politics in France since 1950 with Ian Stewart, and also of last year, Pierre-Rosan Vallon's Political Thought, and finally Foucault, Neoliberalism and Beyond with Daniel Steinmetz Jenkins. So I'm really glad that they agreed to participate in this. My idea was to basically think about the historical detour through the revolution or the early 19th century, the kind of the age of revolutions, to think about current democratic problems, which I think all three books are struggling with. So I'm going to hand over the floor to them to let them say a few things about their work, the readings that we were assigned, and sort of explain how they came to this project and what they see the main stakes of their project being. So I don't know. Do we want to go this maybe alphabetical order still?
Sure.
Does it make sense? Dan, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks so much, Camille, for organizing this and for having me. And do wave if my audio becomes inaudible because there's not a super great Wi-Fi signal where I'm staying. So my book is really an effort to connect the history of human rights to the history of natural law. And the reason I thought this was important is in large part because some of the more influential recent histories of human rights, and I'm thinking in particular of Evelyn Hunt's book, Inventing Human Rights, and of Sam Moyn's now multiple books on the subject, really tried to leave the earlier history of natural law out of the longer history of human rights, arguing that it wasn't that relevant, or that it partook in a different form of universalism, or even that it wasn't really a belief that there existed rights above and beyond the state, and that, say, as Sam argues in The Last Utopia, that even the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, so 1789, really doesn't grant any rights that were not ultimately given to individuals by the state. And so you couldn't appeal beyond the state. So that was, I didn't agree with that, and I wanted to show that, in fact, in this older natural law tradition, it was already possible to appeal beyond the state and to use rights claims to make those arguments. But I was also interested in kind of trying to find a more interesting way to tell the history of natural law. And I think there's two challenges there. One is that, these are often pretty dry books. So you get a lot of histories of, say, Grotius through Pufendorf that are just sort of these little potted histories that essentially are, extended summaries of what each philosopher or theologian has written. But then a lot of the, more scholarly arguments around these texts tended to really focus on what was viewed as a shift between, roughly speaking, the 12th and the 15th centuries, from authors putting natural law first to authors putting natural rights first. And it was really Michel Villet, the French jurist, who kind of framed the history of natural law in this way. Interestingly, Leo Strauss, somewhat independently, kind of came up with the same argument, but then it entered into sort of more, modern intellectual history with Richard Tuck in his first book, Natural Rights Theories, which sort of takes this story that Villet and Strauss had put forward, that we leave this classical world in which natural law determines all of our duties in life, and instead we enter into this modern kind of fallen world in which all of a sudden individuals are making rights claims for themselves. So for both Villet and Strauss, that was a terrible thing. But Tuck sort of reverses it and says, no, this is wonderful. These are the origins of modernity. But lots of historians afterwards, in particular Brian Tierney and Annabelle Brett, pointed out that this is kind of a, as the French say, question mal posée, that there really wasn't a shift from one to the other, that in this later period where presumably we were all we cared about were natural rights, but in fact there was still an equal attention paid to natural law. So, like, just to take the example of the Declaration of Independence, yes, there are rights that are enunciated, but it's still in the name of the laws of nature and nature's God that you get those rights. So it's a correlative process. It is through law that we are given rights, and it's because we have rights that we can recognize a law. So what I was interested then is, like, well, what do we talk about? What is really at stake during this period? Why do these philosophers feel the need to write 600 pages of dense Latin refuting each other? And it came to me that what was really at stake during this period, and by period I should say that I really focus on the period between the wars of religion and the age of revolution. And not to say that this starts at the wars of religion, I don't think it does, but I think that a lot of these claims that were sort of bubbling up in late medieval discourse become sort of weaponized at the time of the wars of religion, and sort of that's why I think it makes for a good, if not starting place, a good place to pick up the story. But in this middle, early modern period, what's really at stake is not so much the question of, do all humans have rights? That's not an issue. Everybody agrees that, sure, in the state of nature, we all have rights. But all the disagreements come from what happens to those rights when we enter into political society. And here it seems that there are three general possibilities that people more or less work with. And I should say that these are kind of ideal types rather than exact structures that you would find. There are those who say that we preserve the rights. We have these rights from nature. We keep them in every situation. And interestingly, that's almost, you could say, one of the oldest of the ideas. You find it it's banal in the 16th century. This is not like the more modern version of it. Indeed, the more modern ones, the two arguments that, or as I call them in the book, regimes that really dominate in this early modern period are one, what I call the abridgment regime. So this idea that Hobbes in particular puts forward, like the very condition of having political society is that we give up most of our rights. So we have to renounce them. Maybe you keep one or two. That's why I call it a regime, because overall you're renouncing, even if a couple of them you still sneak in. But it's mostly about giving them up. And then there's a third regime, which I call the transfer regime, which you find, say, in Spinoza or in Locke or in Rousseau. And that idea is that, well, you do have to give them up, your rights, but you give them up to government. Or to the whole community. And so what's really interesting in the early modern period is that it's those two other regimes, the transfer and the abridgment regime, that are preponderant. Very few people believe that you should keep all of your rights when you enter into political society. And so in the end, my book is sort of trying to figure out how did that version, which is going to triumph during the French Revolution, how did it impose itself on the others? And I really show it's a kind of contingent story. It was not predetermined. It had a lot to do with the political turmoil of this time, and the fact that that was sort of viewed already in the 16th century as the most revolutionary way of dealing with rights. And just to sort of focus on the French story for this crowd, you have a chapter in the American Revolution in the book as well. I show that in the 18th century, it was largely thanks to the physiocrats that the idea that we preserve our natural rights re-enters into the political discourse. And I think that isn't a coincidence. It has a lot to do with the fact that physiocracy was originally and foremost an economic doctrine, right? And so when the physiocrats say, yes, we keep all of our natural rights, they mean property. And so, François Quenet can say that, and he can, be buddies with Louis XV and be, as close to power as you can be, and not be seen as saying anything revolutionary, because they thought he was just talking about property. But very quickly, that same claim would be picked up, including by the other physiocrats, not just to be about property rights, but to be about political liberty, to be about other kinds of rights claims, indeed the very rights claims that would make their way into the Declaration of Rights. And I'll just end by saying that I do think that there's a way in which the physiocrats are perhaps one of the most important groups for the proclamation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, not only in terms of the intellectual history, but even the social networks that were important in the run-up to the actual declaration, and also during the debates themselves. All right, so I'll just leave it there and pass the baton to Sophie.
Okay. All right. Should I just start in with the expectation? Okay. Dan gave a very eloquent account just now of the sort of main arguments of his book, but his book is I think of a slightly different nature, because it's actually a long, serious, well-researched, profound book. And, the book that I'm talking about today is, in some sense, not a standard academic book, in that it was written quickly, it was published quickly, it's short, and it's I would describe it as a kind of blend of history and political theory, an attempt to sort of create some genre in between the two. And it came about as really a response to the present. After the election of Trump, I think, like everybody else, I was slightly obsessed with the news. I looked at my phone a few too many times a day, and over time it sort of came to me that my news obsession was slightly converging with my longstanding academic obsessions, and I thought the only way to do something about it might be to try to put them together in some way. But the longstanding academic obsession was something about the sort of tacit assumptions underlying democracy and where they come from, and in particular the kind of epistemological assumptions that undergird democracy. And those sort of tacit assumptions that I think I'd been studying for way too many years turned out to sort of come into conflict in this particular moment. So this was something like an experimental book that I dropped other things to write quickly as a kind of, it's really a thought piece more than a major work of scholarship. And if you were kind enough to have read any part of it, particularly the part for today, you'll see that the point was to say something about the relationship between democracy and truth that neither went to the idea that there was something absolutely timeless about that relationship, nor the claim that it sort of was all a product of social media or Rupert Murdoch, or it all emerged in the last 5 to 25 years. So I went back to sort of see if I could uncover something about the relationship between truth and democracy from their kind of modern foundational moment. I really sort of start where Dan leaves off in some sense with when he gets to the physiocrats and the French Revolution. I sort of pick up in the middle of the revolution and in the middle of the Enlightenment and the flourishing of the age of revolutions, to look at the very particular version, which is actually kind of peculiar, of truth that becomes important to the making of democratic politics. And in a nutshell, I'd say it's this. On the one hand, truth is supposed to be particularly important to democracies. It's supposed to be the thing that they are founded on and the thing they create. And that's really in contradistinction to monarchies, which are become increasingly tainted by being associated with subterfuge and deception and secrecy of different kinds. That said, the other feature of truth in a democracy, as envisioned in the Age of Enlightenment, so again, I don't think this is sort of has to be in the nature of democracies, is that truth also, despite how important it is, isn't going to come from any one place. It's not going to be dogmatic. It's always going to be contingent, and no one sector, person, institution gets to determine it for everyone else. Not a cleric, not a single leader. And that means it's going to be a kind of messy social business. And so I was interested in this fact that truth gets sort of put on a pedestal. And by truth, I mean both in the moral sense of the opposite of lies and in the epistemic sense of the opposite of what you might call unverified belief or erroneous information. So on the one hand, truth is exalted. On the other hand, it's given very little definition. There's not much to it except for the idea that it will require the deregulation of print and speech and some kind of trust in others and maybe some kind of conviction about plain speech to flourish. And that has meant that truth in practice in democracies has always been really contested and really precarious. So in a sense, the rest of the book, the part you didn't have to read, is about how that contentiousness is played out. And I see it largely having played out as a continual conflict between those we might now call, or since the 19th century, experts, a kind of elite version of truth that says truth comes about through specialized knowledge and quasi-scientific means of getting there. And on the other hand, a more populist conception of truth that emphasizes instinct, faith, and basically experiential knowledge above all else. I'm interested in the dangers of each of these forms of knowledge without the corrective of the other. I'm interested in how both of them develop in time in contradistinction to each other, which is to say, it's interesting that expertise, professionalization, specialization, quantifiable knowledge all take off in response in some ways to growing democratization in the 19th into the 20th centuries, but at this, with roots in the 18th century. But similarly, popularism also has its kind of Enlightenment roots and takes off as a response to a kind of effort on the part of elites to try to monopolize truth. And I think both of those have grown in intensity, taking us to the present. That they've been there a long time, but they've collided, especially in recent years, and that might be true whether you're looking at the politics of Washington or the politics of the EU. So the political theory part, the kind of normative part, is about the ways in which these two efforts to monopolize truth, in a sense, mirror each other and then work against a kind of pluralistic, democratic notion of truth. And the historical part is really about how this all comes to pass. And I don't dismiss the importance of a lot of recent disruptions in what might be called the public sphere, including the rise of things like social media, which are really only 15 years or so old. But I don't think that can tell the full story. I think the full story of how you get to a conflict over truth like the one we're experiencing today requires a kind of shallow history and a deep history at once. And I could have told the story exclusively about France. I could have told the story, I think, exclusively also about the United States. But like Dan, I tried to range a little wider than that. It emphasizes those two stories, perhaps because those are the ones I know best. But it's really supposed to be about modern democracies tout court, in the sense of the structural problems that seem to be the lot of democracies in many parts of the world right now. So that's really what the book is about.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sophie. And especially alphabetical has also taken this historically to Steve, so because you're in the last phase of what follows from.
Yeah, we're moving chronologically here. True. Alphabetical and chronological.
How amazing. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you for putting this together, Camille, and for H. France. It's just a real pleasure to have a chance to talk about the book. So Demos Assembled, I guess I should say at the outset that it is part of what I hope to be a larger project, and that I'm currently referring to as a critical history of democracy, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm working on a follow-up volume that will cover the period Demos Assembled, covers 1840 to 1880. I'm currently working on the next volume, which will be 1810 to 1850, with the working title of The Democratic Revolution. And I guess the larger project of which Demos Assembled is a part consists of, it has sort of two aspects to it. It has two portions to it. And the first is a key, it's sort of a rereading of key texts, a kind of critical intellectual history, if you will, of authors that I suggest may be read differently if we place democracy at the center of the story as opposed to, let's say, liberalism or classical republicanism. And the second related aspect is an attempt to rediscover some of the substantive, concrete activities that constituted democratic action before the vote came to monopolize our conception of the democratic, which I situate largely in the Second Empire. And so the idea is to see some of the very creative ways that democracy was being conceived of from 1750 to 1880. And what Demos Assembled tracks within that is this sort of final moment when democracy is at once triumphant, and yet what it generates then is a whole set of very critical visions about what democracy would mean. And each of the authors that I discuss follows through with a very critical, at once accepting notion of democracy, and yet a very critical notion. So I guess I should say, I mean, part of the larger idea behind this is that I think, as this webinar attests, I mean, I think there are few people that would contest the idea that something like the democracy, or that the revolutions that spread across the Atlantic world in the 18th century and into the 19th century are in some broad sense democratic. That seems to just be at some level a kind of just accepted. And yet it struck me the extent to which political historiography of the 18th and 19th centuries have really focused on other terms to think about the structures of political modernity, and in particular liberalism and republicanism. And so The idea here is, to some extent, to try to understand, well, what happens, not to discount the liberal or the classical Republican story, which are obviously fundamental to the emergence of the modern state, to political modernity, but what happens if we try to isolate something, or we try to understand what we might call a democratic tradition, or what I refer to in the book sometimes as the democratic, and we try to understand, does that have a history? Is it just too murky of a term? Or is there kind of a relative beginning, the way, let's say, classical republicanism has its origins in a neo-Aristotelianism in the Italian Republican city-states? Is there something that emerges? And so I think a lot of what's in the book will probably become more clear as the rest of the project unfolds. So the book turns away from a kind of a very common story about the exceptionalism of French republicanism, as well as the exceptionalism of a kind of French liberalism, that somehow French liberalism was distinct from other liberal traditions, and actually tries to argue, well, what if we put a transnational democratic turn that I suggest takes place across the Atlantic, at the center of the story of French history, and what emerges in that. So in this case, instead of sort of looking to liberalism to save French democracy from itself, which is a very common sort of narrative around French Jacobinism, or sort of liberalism pitted against 1793, if you will, or instead of understanding that democracy only really emerged in France through the Republic, this looks towards sort of where France tries to sit itself within a larger international democratic movement. It was, of course, recognized, and this is just abundantly clear when you try to set your sights on democracy. It was abundantly clear to both the French, but also across the United States, Latin America, and Britain, and the continent of Europe, that France had a very special role to play in sort of thinking about what would be involved in the democratic, a sort of modern conception of the democratic. And this has clearly to do at once with its relationship to the Enlightenment as a kind of one of the key epicenters of the Enlightenment, and of course the revolution and the revolutionary tradition that emerges out of 1789 and continues into the 19th century. I guess, without going into some of the complexities of what I've tried to isolate as the democratic tradition or the democratic, one thing, we could just say something quite straightforward, which is that at the heart of this project is this idea of the demos. And to just say in very straightforward terms, the idea is that what emerges in the old regime and then really sort of becomes a central problem has to be redefined in the post-revolutionary period, and then becomes an essential issue between 1840 and 1880, is this question of the demos, which I am understanding as a kind of alternative to a liberal vision of civil society or a Republican notion of the polity. That is, it is a politically saturated or a politically constituted notion of the social, which I think, as I try to argue in the first chapter, which I didn't send, I think Tocqueville this is part of what Tocqueville is trying to get at with his notion of the equality of condition. So what he is, he's sort of reinventing this idea of what it actually means to have a society that is politically constituted, instead of constituted as individuals that come together based on a sort of notion of civil society that is the pursuit of individual interest and purely grounded in other ideas of private property, or perhaps very much the preservationist theme that Dan was talking about. And so in Demos Assembled, I argue that an intense engagement with the democratic from the 1840s to the 1880s, and in particular, 1848 has a fundamental role to play in this, because that's when we really see, as Louis Blanc says, democracy taking center stage. That this moment of a politically saturated society comes to a head. And I argue that this generates a whole series of problems, which is tied to a methodological argument that I try to make in the book, which I won't insist upon. If people have questions, I'd be happy to talk about it, but what I refer to as a pragmatic history of the political. And I argue that a series of problems emerge through which people the people discussed in the book try to determine what a critical approach to modern democracy would look like. And those themes are the chapters of the book. They are inequality, equality, emergency, necessity, terror, and exclusion. And I argue that attempts to reckon with these problems revealed the extraordinary capacity and challenges of organizing a society democratically. These problems, however, emerged at a crossroads, and this is an essential part of the book. Every chapter in the book treats the notion of empire, for example, the questions of exclusion, questions of emergency. And so these problems emerge at a crossroads that is at the intersection of new possibilities for popular participation and in processes of state construction on the one hand, and on the other, the very realities of a brutal imperial expansion, new modes of government oppression legitimized by exceptional circumstances, necessity, gender and racial exclusion, and massive socioeconomic inequality. So this becomes a part of the dissatisfaction with the democracies that are in the name of democracies alternatively defined. But this is very much not an attempt to say, well, there is a democratic tradition. It has sort of an ideal that it's trying to achieve, and sometimes it succeeds and sometimes it fails. It's quite the opposite. That is that when democracy really asserts itself as the sort of most powerful way of understanding what political modernity will look like in France, it involves a deep dissatisfaction with the present and an attempt to generate new thinking about what a democracy alternatively defined would look like. And this is what I understand to be a critical democratic history. So the 40-year period explored in the book represents a relatively short moment in the long history of democracy, but I think its brevity is trompeur, as they would say. One struggles to imagine the kind of profound discredit of democracy in, let's say, 1810 and 1815 as the world looks on the terror and Napoleon and says, look, this is clearly where democracy leads. And yet, throughout the first half of the 19th century, the word and the term and the idea and the tradition will slowly be reinvented. And by 1848, it is clear that it is going to have some role, some structural role in political modernity. And no doubt what happened in the 3 decades that followed marked one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of this very old set of ideas. On the one hand, because even a democratic despot, as he is referred to, such as Napoleon III, can claim to be democratic. So this term has become so ubiquitous that even somebody like Napoleon III thinks he needs to call himself a democrat. And what it generates is a massive, at once, dissatisfaction with the democracies in which they're living in the name of a democracy alternatively defined. And ultimately, an attempt to show or a discovery that democracy actually establishes the foundations for a critique of itself, a kind of imminent critique of the democratic. So I think I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So I thought the three books are fantastic, and I think like there's a lot of overlapping connections, suggestions, but I want to open it up to the audience. But I was just going to suggest before I do that, point my finger on 5 themes that I see as kind of cutting through all of these 3 books. So I'll just, and we don't have to respond to them. I can just kind of put them on the table, and you can respond to it as we go along if you're interested, because they're sort of large questions. But so the first one that I've been thinking about is the relationship, the fact that you all present democracy as a kind of historically specific formation. Basically, how you're dealing with the tension between a kind of more structural political theory analysis and a more historically driven understanding. I mean, Sophia, you actually brought this out explicitly when you said that you were kind of navigating the boundary between history and political theory. and Steve, you talk about the democracy as a kind of historical practice. But I would love to sort of see, to hear you think about the kind of tension between, as I said, a kind of more structural analysis and the more historical analysis, how you're treating these concepts. So both, Sophie, in your case, the kind of relationship between democracy and truth, Dan, the relationship between democracy and rights, and Steve, democracy and the state, right? That's the first idea that I was having. The second one is sort of related to the first one, but it's also the problem of democracy as a regulative ideal. What was really interesting in reading all three of you was how the kind of split between content and ideal, that there is, that, so Sophie, you say that basically democracy never functioned the way it was supposed to. Steve, you talk about this idea of a critical democratic history, but against the ideal of democracy. And and the fact that, as you just mentioned, that Napoleon III, even himself, finds the need to invoke democracy all the time. And Dan, so you have these categories of preservation, transfer, and abridgment, but that you also show how, in fact, all the rights are kind of slipping from one to the other, right? So kind of thinking about the abstraction of these categories and the content. That's the second point I wanted to touch on. The third one, again, is something that you guys all brought up now, but it's really the specificity of France in the projects, which is very interesting. In some ways, none of you make France, you all are struggling to, or you're all aiming, I think, to de-exceptionalize France in different ways. So France obviously has a kind of locus of this democratic production, but you all go through these different routes. So Sophie, obviously the focus on the US, complementing France, or perhaps, I don't know.
That's right.
Yeah. Steve, I think you have a very clear critique of French exceptionalism in the book, and the myth of French statism. And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about this idea also, what you're getting from the transnational here, how you're thinking about the transnational, how the transnational is different from the comparative, maybe also in relationship to Sophie, and to Dan also, what is transnational, what is comparative. And Dan, again, obviously the detour through Roman law, Dan, the detour through Roman law, natural law, so categories that are not necessary, that get reworked in France, but they're not specifically French. The fourth theme is then we get back to the more specifically French aspect of the project, which is the role of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So again, this is something that you've all touched on, and the way that you spoke was very interesting, because Dan is in some ways, as you said, your period is more the period that precedes the Enlightenment, so the wars of religion. Sophie, you really kind of highlight the role of the revolutions in this, and Steve, the period of kind of democracy's growing pains. So kind of thinking about the role of these the Enlightenment and the French Revolution in your works more generally. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was a kind of methodological question. You're all doing intellectual histories, I think. That's how I'm reading them. So I'd love to hear you. I mean, I think Dan has an explicitly methodological ambition in the book, which was very interesting. I mean, they're all very interesting, but this idea of, so Dan, the turn to the digital humanities that you make at the end of your chapter, but also the critique of Sam Moyne, which is, I think you call your book archaeological as opposed to seismic. so that kind of, I would love to hear you say more about that. Sophie, I mean, you don't use the word genealogical, but it seemed to me also very genealogical, the book, and very interested in kind of unmasking categories and presenting them as neither natural or self-evident, and kind of, again, historicizing these things. So I'd love to hear you say more about that. And Steve, I would also really like to hear more about this idea, I wrote it down, but I can't, pragmatic, what is it? The pragmatic history of the political. If you could say a bit more about that, how you're thinking of this in relation to intellectual history, to other intellectual histories. I mean, obviously there's the work of Rosenfeld was very important here. If you had some thoughts about that, I would like to hear them. So let me see. I think, I don't know if we want to maybe open it up and then return to this as we go along. Just, does that sound good to you guys?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so because there's already a question by Julian Borg that I will read. So the question, hi Julian, the question is that he would love to hear the panelists speak about how the theme or problem of representation fits or conflicts with the three themes of natural law, truth, and the demos, and how does the issue cut across or unite the books?
Good question.
Yeah, so so that's one thing we can start with if you want it, or you could pick up, on some of these questions as you, and also audience, feel free to intervene if you want to jump on the screen. I guess raise your hand with a little raised hand, and we'll put you on.
I'll say something about representation because that's a really interesting question, because of course it's a critical element of modern democracy as it gets reinvented in the 18th century, and yet I'm thinking now about the fact that none of us stressed that in our remarks as a sort of fundamental problem or question. Dan maybe with more legitimacy, because it doesn't emerge really representation as a problem in quite the same way till later. But I think it's kind of fundamental to the truth question, because who those representatives are going to be is from the beginning a highly contentious question. Should they be just a representative of the people? Think about the fact that French revolutionaries, for instance, refused to create slates of candidates. I mean, they refused to, but the instructions were always to pick sort of the best among us at the same time. So there's a tension from the beginning, and it's you can see it in different constitutional arrangements, and you, for instance, almost all the constitutions except 1793 create property holding requirements for representatives, which is to suggest not just that they hold more property, but that they be the kind of people with the leisure, which means that also the education, the social standing, all the things that went with holding more property to represent the people. And whether they had, therefore, Madison's words are, the most virtuous and the wisest among us. Later on, we'd say sort of more expert, and we'd probably forget about the virtuous part. The virtue stuff tends to fall out faster than the learned part. But it does suggest that representation complicates what democracy is going to be from the beginning, and that it's impossible to think about truth questions without representation as part of them. Even if you think of the complicated means of voting, the systems in France or in the United States, the layers of voting, all of this suggests a real concern with trying to find the people who will have the closest access to truth in some way, to represent the people who themselves may be coming at truth from very different ways. So yeah, super question.
Yeah, Dan, did you want to say something, or?
You go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Sophia. I think, so I would have a couple of ways of thinking about this problem of representation, which obviously is central. I guess the first is, it comes out of Bernard Manin's history of representative government, principles of representative government. And when he makes this argument that in the way it was conceived in the revolutionary period, what is so striking is that representative government is presented as a solution to the weaknesses of democracy, to the problems of democracy. And he says, he opens that book saying that the great sort of paradox of modern democracy is that it has turned this thing that was designed to be a sort of way of overcoming the deficiencies of democracy into what we understand to be its foundational, one of its foundational principles. And that's sort of the book that drives the theme that drives that book, or the paradox that drives that book. Of course, he worked very closely with Pierre Rosenfeld, and one of Pierre Rosenfeld's, in his trilogy of 19th century, sort of probably the best set of works we have on the history of French democracy is Rosenfeld's 3 books on citizenship, popular sovereignty, and representation. And I think that what is driving in any case, what is driving my project is an attempt to move, to get back to Bernard Manin's original question that Pierre-Rosan Vallon took up, to go back to that and to say, well, what I'm really curious about are all of the sort of, or let's say as W.E. Du Bois said it, what is really complex about democracy are all the things that we haven't applied it to. So we tend to sort of, there is this monopolization of the vote, this idea that representation is the central element of what modern democracy is. And yet, for much of the period of the 18th century up until Napoleon III, it's one part of it, but it is really just one part. There are a whole set of other experiments. There are so many ways of thinking about what should be involved in the democratic.
Are you saying that's true for France alone or in a whole democracy?
I think that's true. I think that's true in the U.S. It's certainly true in the U.S. You can see signs of this throughout Latin America, throughout the sort of phases following the revolutions of independence in Latin America, some of which are more or less successful. And you see it to some extent in Britain, although that Britain's relationship with democracy, I think, is actually more complicated. I mean, one of the odd effects of putting democracy at the center of the story of political modernity is that Britain shifts from being sort of the center, which it's been through the liberal and the Republican paradigm, to being slightly less central to the key part of the story, which also has an impact on the notion of representation, partly because it put parliamentary government at the heart of our stories of political modernity. Which I don't think was necessarily the case for France or to some extent for Latin America and the US.
Are you saying that England or Britain become less important in practice or in terms of the writing of theoretical accounts of democracy? Those seem to me two quite different things.
Both, right? So
I wouldn't put them together, but okay.
Well, I think in democracy, I think the substantive and concrete activities and the thinking about democracy have walked hand in hand, in fact, in many ways, much more closely than they would in a kind of formal liberal dialogue about rights on the one hand, and then all the activities that we do that are distinct from rights, that are guaranteed by rights on the other. In democracy, once you're talking about a politically saturated society, so much of what you do is political and about sort of defining what this society that you're living in is, because it is never distinct from the collective body of which those individuals are a part.
Although Dan's work really does point to the way in which sometimes the movement of politics and the movement of ideas are not aligned. Things happen on different paces.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to chip in here?
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm poking you.
Sorry.
No, I'm just saying, I'm sorry, I pushed it over to you.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about the way in which, working on rights and working on the way, especially in the revolutionary period, people talk about rights, made me kind of more sympathetic to some of the arguments about how it's totally it's an illusion that we can preserve all of our rights in a political society. So it gets also a bit back to Camille's question, sort of about the ideal versus the regulative versus the reality. And so, for instance, there's this fascinating moment in 1773 in the Massachusetts colony where it's always these upstart Bostonians who are slamming on the table, demanding their rights. Everything that the government, that the crown does, that is perceived in one way as, they don't like it. They quickly get on their high horses of rights. And finally, they get this governor of Massachusetts, Hutchinson, who says to them, look, you guys have elections. You're here at the Massachusetts Assembly. Don't you think that your fellow citizens have to give up some of their, natural rights in order for you to be making decisions on their part? How can you have politics without, essentially, these representatives who are therefore you've given something up, and they sort of hem and haw, say, well, we only give But the kind of fundamentalism here, I think we still, almost maybe suffer from in the country, the way that we see these rights as so can't sometimes make find ways to work out what might be a more reasonable solution. I mean, on the other hand, in France, one thing that I discovered working on the revolutionary period is how there's a whole other set of rights which aren't in the Declaration but fill the conversation about rights, which are those of the nation. And what's interesting about the rights of the nation, this is an old parliamentary claim, les droits de la nation. It's picked up again in the 18th century, les droits nationaux. But who gets to enforce only rep bodies? So very quickly, it's the National Assembly. We have to defend the rights of the nation. In 1793, when they're no longer talking about les droits nationaux, but they're calling them les droits du peuple, is to say, well, the droit du peuple is clearly more important than the droit. Yeah, we recognize that there are still natural rights and individual rights, but we're going to prioritize, essentially the rights of the representatives. I mean, they're representing the nation. They get to say that these are the rights. But I don't think anyone's really managed to sort out that particular conundrum either. And it does to Julian's, great question about how representation really does sort of.
Oh dear.
Yeah, Italian connection. Okay, we'll return to him in a second. Jan, are you still there? No, okay. Oh yeah, you're back.
You're back.
Sorry about that. I think either I said something really off color and I was
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I was done anyway. So.
There was another question actually from someone that I wanted to read. Brian Banks, who says it's a half-baked Friday afternoon comment, but I think it's interesting. It's so he would love to have R.R. Palmer in the room with us. I would too. So,
yeah.
And so he says that I think that each reading offers a critique of this age of democratic revolution. So that's kind of the first question. In many ways, many of the similar pitfalls. By emphasizing democracy and revolution, we're leaving out Haiti and Latin America. How do the panelists respond to something like this? So is democracy an inherently Western story? Which is, yeah, I mean, that was also goes back to the question of French specificity, right? I don't know, it seems like you're all avoided the debate about the locus of democracy being in Latin America or in Haiti. I don't know if it's in the footnotes or not, but that is obviously something that has come up a lot in recent scholarship. So if you have thoughts on that, that would be great. Thanks, Brian, for the question.
Good question.
I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at it. It's because I do actually have part of a chapter on rights talk in notably Haiti and also Spanish America in particular. And I mean, what's quite fascinating is the way in which, at least at the level of constitutions, rights, the literal rights that are expressed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man will get inscribed in all of these constitutions. And they've kind of been hidden because they don't get called out in a preliminary declaration. So you'll find them, say, in like section 6, and all of a sudden you'll get a literal quote, I mean, in Spanish, from the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And this will continue. It's not just in Latin America, it's then later, back in Europe. There's a certain number of rights that are just circulating throughout all of these constitutions. Now, I recognize that constitutional documents do not represent the sum total of all rights claims, but it's quite fascinating to see just how prevalent of a genre constitution writing is. And a lot of the claims about Latin America's importance sort of in the later history of human rights have to do with the fact of how influential they were, around the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration. I will point out, though, that one of the main sources for the Universal Declaration were all of these national constitutions from the 19th century. And John Humphreys makes it clear that that's where he took the constitutions, he took a bunch of draft articles, and then he sort of saw, well, what do we have in common? And so there's an interesting feedback loop where the Declaration gets sort of echoed throughout these constitutions, and then sort of the membra disjecta of the Declaration are then put back together in the 40s into the Universal Declaration. So, I mean, yes, that is a narrative that still puts France at sort of at an origin point here, but I think it's kind of hard to tell the story of revolution in Latin America without acknowledging that it would never have happened, or at least it wouldn't have happened at that date without Napoleon invading Spain and overthrowing the Bourbon monarchs there. So, I mean, clearly there is just a causational story here in which the French Revolution has to play an important role.
I do think, though, that it's a important question, and I wish I were more knowledgeable because I would have a better answer to but I do think that the question also echoes Camille's really important question about when is a democracy a historical creation as opposed to a type in some sort of ideal form. And what's so interesting about Latin American sort of experimentations with democracy in the 19th century are the assumption that is the challenge to the assumption too, and I'm really thinking about this truth problem again, that truth can't be dictated by the state. And in imagining republics and democracies and even liberal states that keep an official religion as part of the revolutionary movement in the 19th century Latin America, you get a really different variant of what it means to put democracy and truth together, one in which a state religion can be imagined as compatible with democracy. Something that, for instance, in the American and French experiments are imagined as impossible. And so I think the importance of expanding, and I would call, I don't know about what they call it the West or not, but I call anywhere in the South or North Atlantic world the West, in the sense that I would say intrinsic to the story of the West is the story of the age of revolutions in the Caribbean, which is really simultaneous to the French Revolution, and expanding after that farther south into Latin America, is to see the variants. So what you see are both similarities and this is this kind of transnational but also comparative. The comparative matters because it's in the comparative that we can see what's historically contingent and what's specific about each of these cases, so that the story of Colombia is not the same as the story of North America, and yet they belong to a world in which they are contingent upon each other too.
Great. Do you want to
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Palmer definitely is sort of one of my major interlocutors and will be as this project moves forward. Just very briefly on Palmer, I mean, there's the question of where he puts emphasis and where he doesn't, but there's also just the question of how he understands the democratic and the fact that he's not particularly interested in interrogating the difference in democracy on either side of the revolution. That he sort of takes democracy for granted as a normative, as Sophia was saying, as a kind of normative concept, and doesn't actually dig into the sort of ways that democracy actually changes, and in fact changes radically in terms of how people understand what it means, what's involved in it, from 1780, say, to 1840. That there's a profoundly different understanding of what's involved in that period. But certainly, a sort of a towering kind of story. In terms of democracy, it clearly is an Atlantic story. I mean, this idea of the pragmatic history of the political is to understand the interactions and the thinking about democracy and the kinds of activities that people themselves place as being constitutive of what being a democracy would involve, that is a sort of process or a way of a framing or a way of thinking about social and political activity from the tip of South America up through northern Scotland and as far west as far east as Eastern Europe. And certainly to some extent, you can see this in North Africa, in Egypt, and in the Middle East. And is a fantastic book by co-edited by Joanna Innes that's looking at Mediterranean notions of the democratic in the first half of the 19th century. That's really showing how widespread this was. Again, I think one of the problems, and this goes back to Julian's question, and it goes back to our thinking of democracy in general. At the heart of this is to get beyond the idea that you are a democracy if you have that the baseline definition of a democracy is that it happens in a given state that is at the scale of the territorial nation state, that you have a parliament, and that you have elected representatives, and at some level the executive is an elected body. That if you have that, you're a democracy. And so the idea of Demos Assembled is very much to suggest that there's just a radical set of ways of thinking about what would actually be democratic between 1840 and 1880. And this is pursued, this has its roots in the 18th century and in the first half of the 19th century. And in fact, it's before the first major wave of the establishment of parliamentary democracies starting in the 1880s, 1890s in Europe, and as far and across the Atlantic and to some extent into Asia, that much of the most creative thinking about the democratic tradition emerges. So it's really a question of sort of uncovering that history and the multiplicity of those ways of thinking about it, instead of saying, oh, well, it started in France because France had a revolution and then they wrote a constitution and therefore they were more democratic than everybody else, right?
Yeah, thanks, you. There's another question from Hannah Malcolm. It's for Sophie more specifically, but anyway, it says, I'll read it. So trust is really crucial for Rosenfeld's argument of the relationship of truth and democracy, but it seemed to me that the expectation was primarily that the common people had to trust experts and their representatives, and that those groups needed to be trustworthy. I wonder if you could talk about instances when the experts or representatives don't trust the people. And then I was curious if Edelstein and Sawyer also see trust as being curious to their stories. I think, yeah, I mean, that's interesting because my reading of your book, of your chapter, was that you were actually saying that they needed to be more symbiotic, that both needed to trust each other, right?
Right. I mean, that's it. Thank you, Hannah, for that question. Again, this takes you to this kind of ideals and practice. If we want to use the French case, since this is H France after all, I'll try to stick to the French examples rather than others. The ideal that emerges by the middle of the revolution is certainly one in which the idea is that the trust is going to have to go in multiple directions. Once there's the possibility of imagining something like universal manhood suffrage, the idea is certainly that a kind of collective ethos will emerge that doesn't privilege any one sector as making real determinations. But that said, it doesn't last very long. And if you want an example of elites not trusting the people, I would say, look to what happens immediately after Thermidor. And part of that is an effort. I mean, I think maybe the best possible example could be the Thermidorian Republic and then into the Directory, where two things happen. One, the franchise is severely restricted and popular politics are essentially curtailed, from club meetings to section meetings to a very restricted franchise that eliminates people both based on the property qualifications and political qualifications. But simultaneously, an enormous effort goes up into building new kinds of experts. And they're not experts who are necessarily the wealthiest people, but people with certain kinds of educations in Republican institutions. So everything from the École Normale to the creation of new kinds of institute that will replace the old academies. So much emphasis, you think, in a war-torn country. Why build all these institutions right away, training engineers, training teachers? And I think all of it has to do with creating a kind of core of what will become civil servants, but also representatives and people who will be the kind of knowledge sector. This is well before we have the really modern, expansive state, but these are state institutions created to form this core at the same time as the people's role in politics, ordinary people's roles in politics, are being curtailed. And that's done in an effort to keep republicanism alive, not to shut it down, but to keep it going. So I would take that, in my own model, to be a case in which the sort of ideal form of democracy is seen by the people who want to keep democracy alive in some form as impossible. Really, we should say republicanism for this. And therefore, because it seems so problematic, they have to use sort of undemocratic measures to keep democracy going. But I'd be interested, if Hannah's still there, if she had thoughts about this and how it worked of her own.
What's interesting, though, is that it gets us all again back to this question of historical specificity, because one of the questions that I had when I was reading your book was also, sort of, why does this come up again in particular moments, right? The crisis. And so now, if truth has always been a problem for democracy, then why is this why does it seem particularly exploding right now? And so you talk about, there's obviously, you talk about the technological shifts, the sort of 24-hour news, but also the aggravation of income and educational inequality. There's something that also Steve brings up in his book, the kind of problem of growing inequality during this period.
Yeah.
So, but in some ways, it's still the question of like, why do these things pop up in certain times, right? More than others. Why do these crises of truth pop up? Why do these crises of democracy pop up again in certain moments more than others? But
That's right.
Yeah.
Hannah, did you have any follow-ups, or does anyone else, actually, Dan or Steve, do you have any thoughts on this question of truth?
Truth or trust?
Trust.
Yeah. Dan, I'd be happy to say one small thing. I do think that, again, if the idea is to understand how these people were thinking and acting in such a way that they were trying to disseminate democratic action deeply into the social, and the ways that the vote, at some level, universal suffrage, once it is finally established under the Second Empire, really is a way of depoliticizing the social, or depoliticizing a whole set of social activities that generates this critical understanding of what's involved. That, yeah, I can't deny I live in a democracy, but this doesn't feel very democratic to me. That feeling that really emerges in the 1850s and 60s, that I think is an essential part of what makes them our contemporaries. So this idea of saturating the social with forms of democratic practice is an essential part of the democratic tradition from the 18th century. Now, Camille, you mentioned Pierre Rosenfeld, and it's true. I've already spoken about him. His work is very influential for me, but he has a tendency in his book that I think talks the most about trust and on counter-democracy to sort of understand this is in sort of two blocks. You have the phase about delegating trust to the vote, and he says that essentially starts in late 18th century and shifts comes up to the 1970s, and now we're in a phase where we need to start thinking about how we're going to institutionalize distrust, right? And he says this is not anti-democratic. This is just a very different way about delegating authority. But I would take issue with that. I think that at some level, what emerges from the very beginning, the reason why, especially starting in the 1840s, so many people on the left and on the right are looking for ways that they can saturate the social activities with democratic practices, what they're confronting is this idea. They know that just a basic sort of relationship of trust between, I delegate my trust to this person for 4 years or for 5 years or for some mandate, is just the thinnest and the weakest way of thinking about what democracy will be, can ultimately be. And it is exactly the person who knows this way of thinking better than anyone else, because he's in these Republican circles in the 1840s, is Louis Napoleon. Mm-hmm. And then he's able to. I mean, you have to recognize it's a very brilliant move. He says, "Look, I got it. I understand. I'm a great Democrat. You're all going to keep voting. We're going to keep popular suffrage. You're going to have a parliament. You're going to have all these things. And then I'm going to speak for you. And this is all we need. And you just have to trust me." So there's a way in which trust becomes the stakes of trust become very high when you limit what democracy is and what's involved in it.
So it's interesting how you're talking about, Steve, with putting the moment of distrust late in the 20th century. I mean, because one of the things that strikes me as the biggest difference between the Anglo-American conception of rights and the continental, and this is where I'm also trying not to make this a French story. I think that the French are just representative of precisely that Roman and natural law tradition, which is shared broadly across the continent. But what's different about the English is that they don't trust their government. And this is, there's long reasons. It goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. But ultimately, the Anglo-Americans think of rights as, how to protect yourself from this untrustworthy government, a government that if you didn't have rights that told them they couldn't, would conduct unlawful seizures, would try to force you to incriminate yourself. So in fact, all of the rights that make up our Bill of Rights are taken from English common law and have nothing to do with the continental natural law tradition, which we think about as giving us the concept of these inalienable rights. So that's sort of an interesting Anglo-American story. Yeah. Whereas on the continent, there is largely this trust that the government you can align civil and natural laws so that the government is not going to go after you. And so the trust, you could say, is perhaps a little naively misplaced, and you just say, well, the real effort should be on getting government right. A good government will give us all the rights we need. We don't need to sort of have these extra Teflon protected rights against our own government, because why would you need to do that? And it's interesting listening to Steve, because it's just, rather than sort of seeing the French Revolution as this moment where the French sort of wise up, like, whoa, that was a really big mistake we made of placing so much trust into the government. It seems that instead, and obviously I'm schematizing greatly, the response was, oh, we put our trust in the wrong person.
Yeah,
and so,
double down on that. Yeah.
It's,
else, right?
Yeah, so we're just gonna try this guy instead.
Yeah, that's great. So there's a question from Julian. Do you want to I think you're on screen, so if you want to just panel your question.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So to quickly introduce myself, I'm a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and my question was about the relationship between the people, or the demos, and the nation, and how these 18th and 19th century thinkers that figure in these three books navigated that relationship. And I found myself wondering about that specifically, in part because of the situation today, where we have a lot of so-called populisms that are also very obviously, and perhaps primarily, nationalisms. And it seems to me that Dan Edelstein's remarks on the droit de la nation also relate to this issue, where there's this moment in the revolution where national popular sovereignty and the sovereign nation states sort of seem to, cannibalize each other, or somehow get into trouble with each other. And so how do you think your respective works may help us revise this correlation between the rise of democracy and the rise of nationalism, if that kind of correlation can be said to exist.
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll just jump in with the 18th earlier part on this, because so the reason why ultimately I look to the physiocrats for saying that they're sort of largely responsible for bringing back this idea that we can keep our rights in society is because they reject the Hobbesian narrative that there is this massive difference between a state of nature and political society. And instead, they go back to a more Aristotelian narrative that, we are always political. So even in our, very simple social arrangements, there's some kind of recognizable political structure there. And we are always natural. So even in our most sophisticated political arrangements, we have these recognizable, natural elements. So it's nature and politics all the way down. But that does lead to a problem. And that problem is, well, then where do we get peoples, right? Because that's the nice thing about a social contract, is that all of a sudden, you wave a magic wand and all of these random, people who are just sort of wandering around, boom, they're a people, they're a nation. And so Kone already starts talking about these nations that just sort of pop up. They're, the people live together, they have kids, their kids have kids, they're still sort of living in the same valley. And, after long enough time, you just call it a nation. Now, what's bizarre about that is the nation is not a concept that you find in natural law thinkers. Mm-hmm. Because for them, if it shows up, then it's just sort of the name to the people after contracted. But, they could decontract and they'd no longer be a nation. And so bringing the nation into this world of rights creates a lot of problems too. So the best example of this is Sawyer in Qu'est-ce que le tiers état, where he puts the nation above everything. The nation is what is, essentially governed by natural law, and already in Sawyer's writings on rights, so his various drafts, he's actually not that, he doesn't sort of double down and say, well, these are all absolutely inalienable natural rights that every individual must have. He's already sort of hedging a little bit and seeming to want to say, and this is obviously a bit open to interpretation, that, well, the nation is ultimately what's going to give these people their rights. So essentially kind of a more Rousseauist view, just without the social contract. So that's all sort of very intellectual and philosophical history, but I think it's a great question, and that it really is this knot that, again, they're going to all struggle over, and it's going to haunt the problems that then Steve talks about in the 19th century to a great extent.
I'll just add to that, and I agree, it's an excellent question, that I think the problem from our perspective is that some of these things are discursive formulations and some of them are actual sociological constructs too. And usually, that's why this is also Camille's question about methodology, why I think that a kind of textual history of democracy often loses something, is that precisely that when you say people, what it was Edwin Morgan perhaps who said something like, people's the names some people give to some other people. It's kind of it's an idea, but then there are actually some real people too, and how are those things fit together is part of the conundrum. So, and the same goes for nations, an even more abstract category that some people impose on some other people. But I guess the larger point would simply be precisely that dualism, that the people can be a sociological fact and can be an abstraction, and that those two things are always in tension with one another in some way, is kind of one of the central features for me of democracy. Whether you call it people or nation or citizens or something, you you don't evade the problem in a way. And so a full history of democracy, to my mind, would not try to collapse those differences, but would actually pay a lot of attention to where they emerge, where the kind of fissures are between those facts. And one of the things about populism today is precisely the fact that in talking about what the real people believe or the true people or something is precisely the way in which it tries to write some people in and some people out. Mm-hmm. And that's a constituent feature, I think, of democracy. But how that happens is different in every instance, in every national setting, in every particular moment. And to really write the history of democracy, you have to be attentive to that all the time. If you just stay at the level of discourse, it might seem clear who all of those people are.
No, I'd have a lot to say on this point. I mean, and also sort of to respond to Sophia's great point there. I think in terms of the question of the nation and the demos, so the way I would tend to understand it is that the nation is one way of understanding the demos, and it becomes the dominant way of thinking about it across the 19th century. So you do have if you're thinking about a politically saturated society, very much along the lines of what Dan was just saying, the physiocrats are caught to some extent. They ultimately try to say, oh, well, as exactly as I think Dan is completely right, that well, what if to be politically saturated is to be natural? Like that maybe the civil society people, maybe the people who want to say that, well, I just keep these individual rights and so I'm outside of political society are wrong. And it's sort of a brilliant compromise or synthesis that they come up with there. But then it raises this problem that Dan suggests. And this problem is going to find its way deeply into the 19th century. And it's going to become the dominant way of thinking about the demos is going to be the nation. Now, the problem is that, for example, in France, the nation crystallizes as the core of an empire. And so the question is, as Sophia just said, of the inside and the outside of this nation or of the demos as such, and who within the empire is a part of it and who is not, and as well as who within the hexagon is a part of it and who is not, the stakes of that question are going to become very high. And just to come back to Sophia's point, which I think is a very good one about the sociological principle versus the political principle of the people. I mean, as far as I know, it's, Schmidt is one of the first people to really emphasize that distinction. That is a point that Schmidt makes very clearly. He says that ultimately you have this tension between the sociological reality or the sociological actuality of the people, but you also have the principle of the people, and it is the impossibility to ever overcome this aporia that ultimately requires a sort of leader. Claude Lefort, as well as Cornelius Castoriadis and many others, are going to say he was right on the distinction, he was wrong on the solution. That actually it's the maintenance, very much along the lines of what Sophia is suggesting, that it's the maintenance of the tension between those two principles that actually are constitutive, and therefore you have to follow that aporia through time, and the history of democracy is actually the history of the attempts to solve that aporia. I would tend to suggest, and this comes back to Camille's question, methodological question about the pragmatic approach to the political, which is that Dewey, and there are some others who try to suggest, well, actually, those two are never actually in tension. And Dewey takes on Schmidt very specifically, as does Habermas, as does Honneth, and many others, to suggest, well, actually, there's a way in which the people as such, and so the term generally that this tradition is going to go to is the public as opposed to the people, which is a sort of sociologically saturated notion that doesn't necessarily assume that you're going to have a territorial unit, some sense of homogeneity, some sense of unified principle that runs up against a sociological differentiation. And I think As much as I agree with Sophia that tension is there, and I don't want to deny that, I do think that there is this other tradition that is attempting to sort of think about a politically saturated society as a set of publics instead of as a people in tension with itself.
So if I can just add one thing, though, what I mean is maybe a little different than that, which is not so much where this becomes a problem in theory, and I agree it's in Schmidt, it's in other people, but I really mean in practice. I mean, if we want to get to the revolution in Salon, that, you know, enslaved peoples didn't give a theoretical account of what they were doing. Nevertheless, one could certainly see them as political actors acting in a larger political arena. And I don't simply mean where people notice the gap in practice, in this theoretical way. I mean, what do you do with the existence of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the burning down of plantations outside of Cap Français by enslaved peoples? They don't seem to have any relation to one another in some way. Maybe it's all in our mind that they do, that we're drawing lines, but I do think that's the central problem for a historian of democracy is how are those things happening in the same framework? Are they linked in some way? So it's less a kind of, it's a problem of hindsight and sort of trying to imagine democracy as a practice with not many rules and as a series of elaborately theoretical propositions made by different people over the years that a kind of full history of democracy would emerge, less in the recognition by other theorists of the problem.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Did you have a question? The person who just got on the screen, Joanna?
Oh yeah, I did.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joanna Tui. I'm an undergrad at the University of Colorado Boulder. I just had a quick question, kind of coming from Professor Edelstein's discussion of the shifts in those three regimes you talked about. And this is similar to Killian's question about identity, but I was kind of wondering if you could all three talk a little more about how the kind of dual concept of the national government as the repository of the people's will, or the attempt to see it as such, and the people as the embodiment of the nation, how perspectives of that concept might have influenced perceptions of truth and legitimacy.
Dan.
No, Dan, we lost your sound.
Oh no.
Sorry, I was muted because there are various domestic noises behind me. I missed the last bit. So I heard something about truth and then, sorry, it cut off.
Oh, I was saying, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the perspectives of identity kind of relationships between the nation and the people influenced perceptions of truth and legitimacy.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I don't get into it too much in the book. I mean, I think what it makes me think of, though, is sort of more than the French Revolution, is the way in which for Locke, and this also gets back to the trust question, sorry, just a sec. That Locke sees his conception of the government is that the government should be like a trust, and he means this almost in a fiduciary way, that if you're going to lend your rights to the state, then there has to be not only that you're trusting the government, but also that the government sort of is acting in your interest. So like a trustee would be looking after you. And Locke, of course, has this very, and sorry, apologies to Sophie that I'm still at the very textual and theoretical level here. I know, I'm teasing you. But Locke derives all the powers of the government from the particular rights that we have in the state of nature, right? So the government so the legitimacy of the government is very well laid out. And then again, this is kind of a problem that people who are, our people, right? The people that we call our people, the revolutionaries, with the theory of, these strong inalienable rights, in a way, they have a harder time than explaining the legitimacy of the government. And I think that, the French get around that by falling back on this other old parliamentary notion of the rights of the nation. On the other hand, you could almost say that this is sort of a problem that is haunting American democracy today. That, think of the number of our fellow citizens who think that the American government, the federal government, isn't legitimate. And sort of the crisis of legitimacy, I think, is often connected to a somewhat fundamentalist view about your individual rights.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question, because your use of the word legitimacy, I think, is really important, because states can be legitimate because of their kind of origin story, like powers rooted in the people, or this is a dynasty that's ruled for 1,000 years. But they can also be legitimate because they work, and because people say, hey, I'm getting something good out of that, that's a pretty good state, or vice versa. And the problem right now, I think, with the sort of anti-government rhetoric can tend to be self-reinforcing, because then if you don't put energy and effort into making the state effective, it doesn't work well, and it reinforces the idea it's not worth having in the first place. So I think those two kinds of legitimacy are both important. One is that storyline, the way, and each of the kinds of politics has a different storyline. Democracy tends to have the storyline that the people have some fundamental right to make laws for themselves, and self-rule as a kind of exalted state. And then there's the legitimacy of just, even if you tell people that, but it's a really failed state and you can't keep the electric power on and there's no police force, it's pretty hard to tell people that's a very legitimate state. So they're both kind of vital, I think, in what makes a democracy sometimes work and sometimes seem really illegitimate for all the theoretical underpinnings.
Thank you so much for your question. Steve, did you have any last thoughts, or we have to finish soon, but I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to say to this question.
I don't have anything specific to add. I mean, I would just reiterate the point about the nation, that I think that the relationship between the nation and democracy has a history, and is not a natural relationship, and that there are a whole set of people who have tried to think about democracy at a multi-scalar level that does not sort of naturalize the nation as the scale at which that necessarily takes place, and have thought a lot about how democratic action can be legitimate, whether it's in a workplace, whether it's in certain kinds of economic activity, whether it's in judicial practices, that all of these things that Sophia was talking about, sort of everyday actions. There are ways of thinking about legitimacy that might appear to us to have very little to do with democracy per se, but are start to be understood in the 19th century as activities that are more or less legitimate ways of organizing ourselves. How even banks can function in a legitimate democracy. How I would borrow money in a democratic regime. And so, as important as the nation is, I do think that legitimacy steps far beyond that.
So much, Joanna, for logging on for your question. So I just want to, we're unfortunately out of time, but this has been really a fascinating conversation, and I just wanted to thank again the three of you for participating in this, and remind our audience, our virtual audience, the titles of your book, Democracy and Truth by Sophia Rosenfeld, On the Spirits of Rights by Dan Edelstein, and Demos Assembled by Stephen Sawyer. They're really three, I really enjoyed reading them and thinking about these issues with you guys, and just historically, but also really to try to illuminate some of our current crisis and concerns. So thank you so much for.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing and moderating and all the rest.
Thanks, Camille. Great job. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone
Thank
for
you very
joining.
much. Great to see everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Guys. Ciao.